Hello again. I'm here with Lindsay Robertson, professor of law here at the University of Oklahoma. I would try to run through all of the titles attached to your name, but my memory is slipping in my old age. But welcome, Lindsay. Thanks for coming.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
Good. Could you tell us a little bit, as we're working our way through Cherokee nationalization, just a little bit about your background, how you came to Indian law and the work that you do here?
Sure. I started practicing Indian law in Washington, D.C. in the late 1980s. When I started practicing Indian law, one of the big focuses for D.C. Indian law firms was land claim litigation. Mm-hmm. And so I got involved in that a little bit, and then in 1988, Congress passed the Indian Gaming Regulatory Act, which created an interest in lots of tribes that established gaming operations and diversifying their economy. My legal background prior to becoming an Indian lawyer was as a business lawyer.
Oh, okay.
And so I suddenly found that skill set involved in tribal representation, and what had started out as just a part of my practice became most of my practice. In 1991, I was invited to teach or co-teach a course in Indian law at the University of Virginia Law School, which is where I went to law school. And I did that for a number of years, and it was fun. I went back to school, got a doctorate in history, focusing on the history of federal Indian law and policy, and then decided with that to become a teacher full-time.
Okay.
Because it was fun. And I joined the faculty of the College of Law at the University of Oklahoma in 1997, and I've been here ever since. I'm a professor of law and director of the Center for the Study of American Indian Law and Policy at the College of Law.
Yeah, you've got a lot to contend with there.
It's a busy life.
I believe that.
But a fun one.
Yeah, good. Well, as an expert in federal Indian law, you can answer some questions that maybe we've got coming up here. Let's start with John Marshall. His trilogy, the Marshall Trilogy, as we sometimes hear it referred to, in many ways kind of laid the bedrock or the foundation for federal Indian law. Is that right?
Yeah, you can't. It's impossible to talk about the rights of tribes without sort of wrapping your mind around how the federal court system has defined those rights. Mm-hmm. The world that we live in really is fixed by the U.S. Supreme Court. And while there are rights that people will argue go kind of beyond what the Supreme Court recognizes, it's those rights that the Supreme Court recognizes that tribes can enforce and actually get federal support for enforcing. So that's kind of the focus of federal Indian law and policy. And as you mentioned, these three John Marshall decisions, which we call the Marshall Trilogy, are the foundation. They create sort of the framework within which most of federal Indian law has developed ever since. They've given us some of the concepts that we have to work with, some of the relations that we have to understand.
Right. Working at cross purposes sometimes.
Yeah, sometimes hard to reconcile, although reconcilable. And that's where sort of the view of the historian comes in.
Right. Well, let's see if we can work those out. But let's start at the start with Johnson v. McIntosh.
Yeah.
And this was the subject of your book.
It was, yeah. This was a book that came from my doctoral dissertation. The book came out in 2005 and paperback in 2007, and it's really a history of the Marshall Trilogy, but focusing on this first of the three cases, Johnson versus McIntosh.
Okay, and this is Conquest by Law.
Is the book, yeah. Now there are three cases in the Marshall Trilogy. The first is Johnson versus McIntosh, 1823. The second is Cherokee Nation versus Georgia in 1831. And the last is Worcester versus Georgia in 1832, which is probably the best known.
Right.
It's the case that's then followed up with Indian removal and et cetera. Johnson versus McIntosh, the first case, a lot less has been known about. It was a case that arose before the British Empire collapsed. So in 1773, 1775, two interlocking groups of land speculators based in Philadelphia and Baltimore, Maryland for the most part, decided to go west out into what would be the old Northwest and is now the states of Indiana and Illinois, and buy some Indian lands.
Lots of Indian lands.
See how much they could get away with. Their problem was that it was illegal under British law. The King of England, George III, the guy who talked to trees in his latter years, had issued a proclamation in 1763 at the end of the 7 Years' War saying basically part of the problem we had And part of the reason we had to fight the French is that a lot of the tribes out west were kind of pissed off at what colonists were doing. And so we want to keep those people apart. And so the proclamation, among other things, says that there's going to be a line that runs down the ridge of the Appalachian Mountains. And all the English folks on the east side of that line are going to have to stay where they are, because everything west of that line is reserved to the Indians under our protection.
This is a fascinating sort of counter story that we're typically used to hearing about unfettered expansion, when in fact the Crown was interested in limiting expansion across the continent.
Well, and the United States afterwards, because it sort of got effectively replicated by the Continental Congress. Sort of, we're going to take charge, we're going to regulate the acquisition of Indian lands. We don't want people just going out there unrestrained and causing military problems for us.
Right.
Well, what these speculators did was to get a hold of an old British Crown officer in London, a guy called Lord Camden. And with his help, they located an old legal opinion that if you changed a word here and maybe sort of modified a word there, deleted a word here, could be read to have overturned the proclamation of 1763's restriction on acquisition of Indian lands.
Okay, so this is not that was not what the legal opinion said, was that you could overturn that edict.
Well, what the legal...
They perpetrated a fraud.
My medical friends tell me I can't say it was a doctored opinion, but I can say that it was a modified opinion. Driven by fraud. What they had done, the opinion had been written at the request of the British East India Company, which was going to the Indian subcontinent and as part of its activity, acquiring land from local princes and moguls. The problem that they faced was that they couldn't buy those lands without the king's permission. So they'd be sitting at dinner, and somebody would say, an Indian mogul would say, "Would you like to, buy this land?" They'd say, "That'd be great. Hang on." They'd send the boat back. 6 months later, it would arrive in London. King would say, "Sure, I don't care." And then 6 months later, it'd come back, and the guy would be dead, right? Or have changed his mind or something like that.
Right.
So they requested an opinion from the top Crown law officers that His Majesty's permission was not necessary. And so the opinion in its original form said, as to purchases of land from the Indian princes and moguls, His Majesty's letters patent are not necessary. Title to the land vesting in the company. And the words they changed. They took out that moguls business,
right.
And they changed the word the company to the grantee. So it now read, as to purchases of land from the Indian princes, His Majesty's letters patent are not necessary. Title to the land vesting in the grantee. And it's that sort of accident of nomenclature that we credit Columbus with Indians, they're all,
right.
So that turned out to be useful to these land speculators.
A wide financial world opens up there.
Well, it turned out. And so these guys and others in North Carolina ended up getting copies of this thing. We call it the Camden-York opinion. And they carried it west, and they showed it to British military commanders and said, "Look, the proclamation's been overturned, so we get to buy this land." And the British garrison commanders said, "Well, okay, I guess, but it doesn't say you can occupy it. So you go ahead and buy it." And that was fine for the speculators. They ended up buying, as you suggested, massive quantities of land in these two purchases in 1773 and 1775 from the Piankashaw and the Wea and the Illinois Indian nations.
Okay, so what went wrong that gets us to the case?
Well, then they had to get somebody to recognize the validity of the title that they had purchased. And so this happened in 1775 as the British Empire is coming to pieces. So they went to Virginia's royal governor, who was sympathetic. He sent a note back to London. They were not sympathetic, but they were preoccupied with other things. It's a really interesting letter I found in working on this book in the British Archives, sent by the British garrison, the British military commander in Boston back to London, saying, this is the first purchase, saying, we had terrible news. This guy's out there, he's buying Indian lands, he's got this opinion. We can't believe it's authentic. What should we do about it? And then there's a postscript after his signature in which he says, "Oh, by the way, a bunch of Bostonians dressed as Indians threw tea in the harbor last night, but we don't think anything will come of it, so not to worry," which is interesting. It shows you the Boston Tea Party.
The optimism.
Well, but the Boston Tea Party was a lesser event than this land purchase in the minds of contemporaries. They were sure that this was going to precipitate another Indian war.
Oh,
But then the revolution starts, and so they went to Virginia's revolutionary government. They weren't going to recognize it. They went to the Continental Congress. They weren't entirely comfortable with recognizing it. And then the war's over. There's a new constitutional government, so they go to them. And they ended up spending 50 years trying to get some public authority with jurisdiction over the lands to recognize them as valid. And eventually, they gave up on Congress and went to the Supreme Court. And that's what this case was, Johnson versus McIntosh.